just to get an idea of where you guys are. How many have ever heard of Gog and Magog? Okay, so that's what I thought. So we're going to talk about this individual in this chapter, or two chapters actually, named Gog, and this prophecy of a coming leader who's going to lead all these armies against Israel and how Israel's going to overcome. And there are people today who believe that that prophecy is not fulfilled because it never really specifically says who it is as far as in history. And because it's a very general prophecy, it's hard to nail down exactly who it was in history that it's talking about. And so there's some people that try to say it's something that's yet to happen. And people who have a premillennial persuasion like to take the end of the book of Ezekiel and make it about futuristic earthly Israel prophecy. And so I'm going to, over the next 2 weeks that we have left, be unwinding a bunch of this premillennial doctrine that they take from these latter chapters of the book of Ezekiel. But there's also the other confusing thing is that in the book of Revelation, it talks about Gog and Magog. Only here, it's not an individual anymore, it's a place. And so they take the Gog and Magog stuff from Ezekiel, the Gog and Magog stuff from Revelation, put it together and act like it's talking about the same thing. And then they take the names and the prophecies and try to apply it to modern countries. And they'll apply it to whoever the latest boogeyman is. Okay? So, in World War I, they tried to apply it to Germany, right? And then the Soviet Union came along. Well, then maybe it's the Soviet Union. Well, then Hitler came along. Oh, no, wait, maybe it was Germany. Oh, wait, no. And then, no, we're back to the Cold War. Okay, for a long time it was Russia, okay? And we'll talk about how they take these words and try to make it apply to Russia. And for a long time it was Russia. And then, after the Soviet Union fell, well, maybe it isn't Russia. And then it's, well, no, it's terrorists. Maybe it's somebody in the Middle East. And now we're back to Russia again, since Putin's got a little more power and stuff. Wants to invade the Ukraine. Now we're back to Russia. So what these guys interpreted as changes, but none of it fits. I'm going to show you that the one thing that the prophecy is definitely not about is some futuristic thing to be literally fulfilled in literal Israel. I have my opinion on who it's about and what it's about and what it is, and I'll share that with you as well. But I'm not super dogmatic on it because there is some question. This is a very difficult passage of Scripture. But the overall theme and the overall message is not difficult. It's like the book of Revelation, when sometimes we want specifics for things that weren't meant to have specifics because they were written in a code language, in apocalyptic language, where he's using symbols. And I'll try to give an example of what I'm talking about before we're done. But I'm hoping we can Gog and Magog it in the first half, okay? So I want you to open your Bible to Ezekiel 38. And we're going to actually read 38 and 39 because whoever did the chapter divisions, I don't necessarily agree with them on this one. I think it's all one thing. I guess you got to break it up somewhere. You could have this crazy long chapter, and we don't want to go all Psalm 119 in Ezekiel. So we're going to be in chapter 38, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog. So it's an individual in a land. Individual, Gog, land, Magog. Some think that Gog is like a title like Pharaoh or Caesar. But anyway, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now that's actual place. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaw, and bring you out and your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed, a great horde with large, small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, Cush, Put will be with them, with all their shields and helmets. Also Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Targamoth and the far north and all its troops, and many nations with you. Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you, and take command of them. After many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade the land that is recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been desolate. They had been brought out of the nations, and now all of them live in safety. You and all your troops and all the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm, and you'll be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the Sovereign Lord says. On the day thoughts will come to your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. You'll say, I'll invade the land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates or bars. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the unsettled ruins of the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. Sheba and Dedan and merchants of Tarshish and all her villages will say to you, have you come to plunder? Have you gathered your hordes to loot, to carry off silver and gold, and to take livestock and goods, to seize much plunder? Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. In that day, when my people Israel are living in safety, you will not take notice of it. You will come from the place from the far north with many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. You will advance against the people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days coming, O Gog, I will bring you out against the land so that the nations may know me when I show myself holy through you before their eyes. This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Are you not one I spoke of in former days by my servant, the prophets of Israel? At that time they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. This is what will happen in that day. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the Sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, every wall will fall to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog and all my mountains, declares the Sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will execute judgment upon him. And the plague and the bloodshed, and I will pour out torrents of rain and hailstones, and burn sulfur on him, and his troops and all of his nations with him. So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know I am the Lord. Son of man, prophesy against Gog. Say, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. I am against you, O Gog, chief of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn and drag you along. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, and you and all your troops and all the nations with you. I'll give you as food of all kinds of carrion birds and wild animals, and you will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the Sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog and those who live in safety in the coastlands, and will know that I am the Lord. I will make known my holy name among the people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned. The nations will know I am the Lord, am the Holy One of Israel. It's coming. It will surely take place, declares the Sovereign Lord. This is the day I have spoken of, when those who live in the towns of Israel go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, and small and large shields and bows and arrows and the war clubs and spears for 7 years. They'll use them as fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fuel, and they will plunder those who plundered them and loot those who looted them, declares the Sovereign Lord. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, in the valley of those who travel eastward to the sea. I will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Ham and Gog. For 7 months the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them, and the day I am glorified will be a memorable day for them, declares the Sovereign Lord. Men will be regularly employed to cleanse the land. Some will go through the land, and in addition to them, others will bury those that remain on the ground. At the end of 7 months, they will begin their search. As they go through the land, and one of them sees a human bone, he'll set up a marker beside it till grave diggers have buried it in the valley of Ham and Gog, also the town called Hamanoth, and will be there. And they will be cleansed, and they will cleanse the land. Son of man, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. Call out every kind of bird and all the wild animals, assemble and come together all to the sacrifice I am preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. There will eat flesh and drink blood. You will eat flesh of the mighty men and drink the blood of princes of the earth, as if they were rams, lambs, and goats and bulls, and all of them fattened animals of Bashan. At the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat until you're glutted and drink blood until you're drunk. At my table you will eat your fill of horses, riders, mighty men, soldiers of every kind, declares the sovereign Lord. I will display my glory among the nations. All the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay upon them. From the day forward, the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord, and the nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin, because they were unfaithful to me. So I hid my face from them and handed them over to their enemies, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them in accordance with their uncleanness, with their offenses, and I hid my face from them. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will now bring Jacob back from captivity, and I'll have compassion on all the people of Israel, and I will be zealous for my holy name. They will forget their shame and all their unfaithfulness they showed toward me when they lived in safety in the land with no one to make them afraid. When I have brought them back from the nations, have gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will show myself holy through them in the sight of many nations. They will know that I am the Lord their God. For though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them. I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so it's a prophecy that in the future, after the Babylonian captivity, when they come back, this enemy army is going to come against them while they're in these unwalled cities, living in safety and peace. And this army is going to come against them, but they're not even going to have to fight, because God's going to fight for them. He's going to send earthquakes and hailstones, and he's going to send fire from heaven, okay? And so, now this is apocalyptic literature. Is this literal, or is this figurative? And is this about back then, or is this about something in our future? That's the questions that we're going to try to answer as we go through the chapter. Let me put on my glasses because I'm old. Okay. Chapter 38 and 39. The outline. Thus saith the Lord, I'm against Gog. Thus saith the Lord, Gog's evil intent. Thus saith the Lord, thou shalt come with an army. Thus saith the Lord, I'll bring a sword against thee. Thus saith the Lord, I'll turn thee back. Thus saith the Lord, call the birds and the beasts to devour them. Thus saith the Lord, I will restore Israel. Now, Dad made this outline, and he did it on all the places where it said, thus saith the Lord. Now, when you're ever writing an outline, let's say you're a Sunday school teacher, you're a preacher, you're going to write an outline. A great way to make an outline of a text, if you're going to go through a text and just teach through a passage, is to find reoccurring phrases. And when you have reoccurring phrases, you use the reoccurring phrase in the text and then the point behind the reoccurring phrase. So Dad made an outline like that. But being the preacher that he was, he also came up with another outline. And here's the second outline Dad came up with, because one wasn't enough. Gog and his allies, number one, Gog is evil designs in Israel, Gog's great invasion, Gog's against Gog, Gog's destruction, Gog's weapons, Gog's dead or buried, and God's invitation to dine upon Gog. Okay, so this one, he just took the things about Gog and made Gog the point of the outline and did it that way. That's another thing you can do if it's a person that's being talked about in a passage and you want to outline a passage, especially if it's like a narrative. You can go through and say, okay, this is the person, and then go through all the things that happened to the person, or the person thinks, or the things that talked about the person in it. And that's also a great way to make an outline of a passage. So that's just in there for free, okay? That's just something I threw in for free for when you're writing lessons. So Ezekiel is to face Gog, the chief prince of Meshish and Tubal. The prophecy is against him, as he did other nations. There's no date for this one. Now, like a lot of the others, he puts a date on it. But for Gog and Magog, this Gog from Magog, he doesn't put a date on it. There's no date on this one. Remember, he'd always say, on such and such a day, and such and such a year. Well, this one doesn't get a date. And by the way, in my opinion, that's one of the clues that this is apocalyptic. But anyway, it appears in 39 as an enlargement of chapter 38. So he says it, what he says in chapter 39, and then he goes back and kind of reiterates it, goes over it again in 30. He says what he says in 38, then he reiterates it in 39. So God is pictured as forcing Gog by means of hooks in his jaws to a great war. His allies are from around the world, north, east, west, and south, and God warns Gog to prepare for battle. Now, I know that you guys, to you, a hook in your mouth doesn't make sense, but in ancient times, it was often the case, something that they would do back then, when they would take people captive, they would put hooks in them, in their nose, in their mouth. They would even pierce their tailbones and hook them from nose to tailbone. The Assyrians did that to the Israelites. But they would put a hook in your mouth or a hook in your nose, and then when they took you into captivity, they would take you that way. And so what God is saying to this wicked leader is, you're a wicked person, and I'm going to take you captive to destroy you. And you're going to think that you're attacking my people to get plunder, but really I've got a hook in your mouth, and I'm taking you to your destruction. And that's an important point to understand about God, is sometimes wicked people think they're doing wicked things for their own personal lusts and desires, but it's actually a trap, like, all Admiral Akbar from Star Wars, it's a trap. It's a hook. And that God will allow you to be drug away by your own sin to your own destruction. Sometimes the way God punishes people is he gives them what they want. And this guy wanted to attack Israel, and he's like, go ahead. And that was just how God was going to destroy him. There's a lot of people who attack God, an impossible enemy to defeat, and they just impale themselves running straight long into his spear. And that's what's happening here. He's like, and so God in this probably says, you think you're doing it, but I'm doing it. And a lot of times, if you see a wicked person starting to do some wicked thing, and you think, they're really doing evil, they're going to get away with it. No, God's just setting them up. You see two people you love, and maybe one of the person's wicked and is in rebellion to God, and they say, they're cheating on him, and they're going to divorce him, and they're going to run off and leave him, and you think, they're doing them wrong. No, they're doing them a favor, and God's dragging them off to their destruction. And God has a way of punishing people by letting them try to do what they want. And that's what's happening here. He forces Gog by Gog's own lusts and desires that control him. Gog is to approach Israel after the return from captivity to make war on her while she dwells in safety in an unwalled city. Gog will come quickly, heavily armed against Israel like a storm. It says he's like a cloud that covers the sky. He devises evil upon Israel, and while Israel rests at peace. Gog believes he's going to a great spoil from Israel. Other nations are known for their trading, are anxiously waiting. Hey, have you attacked yet? Have you got any spoil yet? Hey, let us know when you do Israel wrong. We went in on some of that profit. We'll buy your, they're like, we'll buy your stolen goods, okay? And they feel that God can easily spoil Israel. She's an unwalled, unprotected city. But see, that's the thing. What looks unprotected from a worldly point of view when you're right with God is very protected. Now, when they were walled and ready for war, God sent Babylon and destroyed them because they were sinful. But now they're a new nation just back, unprepared to defend themselves, unable to stand against their enemies, but now God's defending them and they're safe. That's the message here, okay? This is a message of comfort for the Israelites. Remember, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Ezekiel's whole message switches from God's going to punish you from what you did to God's going to lead you back, God's going to restore you. The whole message switches. And it switches from your enemies are going to destroy you, Israel, because of your sin, to because when you repent, God's going to restore you and protect you from your enemies. He's going to take care of all your enemies. And so he's already talked about the present enemies that are going down. Aram, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt. All your present enemies are going down. And any future enemy. this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to protect you. That's what he's saying. And God lets it be known through God that they may think the idea is to take Israel, that it's really God who prompts them into the battle. God will approach with this great horde from the north, and God will be vindicated in the eyes of the heathen in Israel. First, because the prophets foretold it. Second, because of great power God would demonstrate against God. And third, because of the great victory God would bring. God wants to show that he has power. Now see, when he allowed Israel to be destroyed and taken into captivity, that defamed God's name. Because everybody thought, well, the reason Babylon beat Judah and took Jerusalem was because God wasn't powerful enough to save them. Well, God's going to show that he is powerful enough, first of all, by destroying Babylon. Second of all, using the people who destroyed Babylon to send the Israelites back. And then protecting Israel from all its enemies. And wave after wave of terrible kingdoms come against Israel all the way up to the time of Jesus, and they survive it all. Where others fall and others are destroyed, Israel maintains its freedom and its religious liberty. Unbelievably. And you can read about such things in Josephus' History of the Jews. You can read about how the Greeks went everywhere and forced everybody to do their religion and to serve their gods except Israel. And why? It's a neat story. But God, over and over again, protects them because he's going to show his name holy. He was showing people that the God of Israel is real and he's powerful and he's able to defend them when no one else can. God would destroy God's army by removing his bow and arrows, his power. God's army would lay around the battlefield all over Israel. Not only God, but Gog's homeland and the land of Magog will be burned with fire, as well as the land of the Allies and the Isles of the Sea. Israel will be triumphant, not by their own power, but by the miraculous hand of God. Instead of Gog's armies picking up spoil, Israel will pick up Gog's weapons and burn them for 7 years. For 7 years, they're going to have to collect firewood because there's going to be all these weapons they can burn. Since Israel will be triumphant, they will not need weapons in the future. They'll go, oh, now we can defend ourselves. No, they're like, we're protected by God. This will be a good firewood. Let's get a fire started. And so they didn't keep the weapons. They just burn them. And they will grant them 7 years of leisure from wood gathering, which, by the way, in ancient times was probably the one daily chore you just couldn't get away from, and was a constant pain. Think about when you went camping. God will be buried in graves near the trade routes, and their bodies will be so many that they'll have a common grave. So they're going to get a mass grave. Every Israelite will enjoy joining together, burying their enemies. There'll be so many dead people that people are going to get that they're going to hire. Talk about a shovel-ready job. This is one right here. The merchants who desired to partake of Israel's spoil will not pass through that valley to trade because of the smell of the dead. The land will be purified according to the law of Moses after 7 months. So it's going to take them 7 months to bury all the dead, which they had to do to purify the land. You couldn't leave dead bodies laying around under the law of Moses. They had to be buried. And so it kind of gets a weird order because first he says they're going to bury all the bodies, and then he starts talking about how the birds are going to come and eat all the bodies. I'm like, well, which is it? So Israel will be careful to remove any dead that may be defiling the land. Israel will be determined to be purified. Meanwhile, God will invite birds of the air, beasts of the field, to gather up for the supper from the slaughter. The birds and beasts will dine royally, for they're going to be eating princes and drinking princes' blood. And basically, he's just saying you're going to have the humiliation of being eaten by an animal, which in an ancient culture, to die in battle, not get a proper burial, and then been eaten by birds was a horrible, horrible insult to not get a proper burial. And the princes will be like, and just let me go back to that for just a second. You remember, why did pharaohs get buried and embalm their bodies and try to keep their bodies nice and go through this embalming process? Why did they get buried with all this gold and silver and food and servants? Sometimes they'd even kill their wives and kids and servants and bury them with them. Why would they do that? Because they thought that what you got buried with went with you into your afterlife. And so if your body doesn't get buried and it turns into food for animals, what do they think you were in the afterlife? Your skeleton. And so it would be a terrible, horrible thing to not be buried in that pagan mindset. What he's saying. So from this great war, Israel learned that God is the Lord. The heathen will know that God is not unable to save Israel for the captivity, but it was because of Israel's sins. They're going to learn, oh, that's why God was punishing Israel, but now he's restoring them. He will show mercy on those who had borne the punishment in Babylon. And once the chastising was completed, he restored Israel so she could dwell in peace. And all from the north, east, west, and south opposed her will become food for scavengers. Not one Israelite need remain evil Babylon against their will. God is willing to hear them and pour out his spirit on a purified Israel. So before, remember when they were in Babylon, they were sinning. They came, they said, hey, we want to inquire of the Lord. And God told Ezekiel what? Don't talk to him. But now they repent, and now he hears them. So what's the difference between someone who God won't hear and someone who God will hear? Repentance. Okay? So this is a message of hope for the Israelites. Hey, God's going to listen to you again. So who is God? That's the question. And so remember, in Revelation, Gog is a place. In Ezekiel, Gog is a person. A king named, some people say it's a king named Goya or Ganges from Lydia, who reigned a century before Ezekiel, and he stands for Israel, evil in Israel's mind. I don't like this explanation. You know why? Because Gog's in the future, not in the past, and because those names start with the same sound, but they're not the same word. It also sounds kind of like Gomer Pyle. Maybe that's what it's about. No, just because something sounds a little alike doesn't mean it's the fulfillment of it. And there's lots of that silliness. You know, and we'll talk more about that as we go through this chapter. The enemies of Israel after the captivity. Alexander the Great and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. One of those. Now that actually has some plausibility. That's not who I think it is. But that could be. I'm not dogmatic about that. Some think that Gog is the name of a successor of kings like Pharaoh or Caesar. Yeah, okay, maybe, but who? Some think it's a country like Babylon that was written in secret to reveal the destruction of Babylon without mentioning it by name. Well, that would be a good theory, except that Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel already predict the destruction of Babylon plain as day. So that doesn't make sense. And Babylon doesn't do the things that this chapter says. Babylon never comes against Israel and is destroyed. Babylon gets fat and sassy, living in their own city, and the Medo-Persians come and destroy them. So what happens to Babylon and how God destroys Babylon doesn't fit this prophecy. So that's why I don't think it's Babylon. Alexander the Great is a way more logical explanation because he comes from the north and he did gather up other nations against him. Alexander the Great's a way better explanation than Babylon. Some think it's a mountain called Gaia, for Ezekiel had been speaking of mountains, Seir and Edom in 35, and Mount Zion in chapter 36 and 37. It is true that he was talking about mountains in the previous chapter, but it is not true that he's talking about mountains in these two chapters, nor the chapters after. And again, it starts with the same letter, good for you, but it's not the same word. It's not Gog. And Gog is obviously a person, not a mountain here. 6, some hold it to be apocalyptic language for the enemies of God. Gog is a Sumerian meaning darkness. So it's considered the personification of evil. It's just a prophecy about anyone that comes against Israel. Well, I don't think that's the case because the other things in there might be symbolic language, but they have some sort of literal fulfillment. So I lean away from this interpretation, but that's a better interpretation than saying it's something in the future. And some believe it's Antiochus Epiphanes, who joined all the other nations against Israel. You can read about that in Clark's commentary. That's the one that I lean towards, is this particular guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. So this is going to be in the intertestamental period. It's going to be after they come back from captivity, before Jesus comes. Alexander the Great comes, and he doesn't fight Israel, nor is he destroyed by Israel. But he does go off into another battle where he's killed. Then his Greek empire is split into 4 divisions, as was prophesied by Daniel, and his 4 generals took over and divided up the Greek Empire. And the successor of one of those generals is this dude. And he does join some other nations to come fight against Israel. It was a terrible time for Israel, and it was a war, and it was in the right period of time when it's predicted. And so I lean towards it, that it's towards him. But because this passage is so exaggerated and symbolic in what it predicts, it's hard to pin down and say, yeah, it's definitely him, and here's why. Because this prophecy is very general. And when you read it, you read about, oh, there's fire, there's brimstone, there's earthquakes, there's hail, all this stuff, and it just sounds. And so God's doing all these things, and so there's a temptation to say this is literal. And I'm going to go through some reasons why I think he's using symbolic language here, and he's actually appealing to Israel's past, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so there's some reasons why I think it fits with Antiochus Epiphanes, because the language in it isn't specific, it's apocalyptic in its nature. So Magog is of Jephthah, the line. So Magog's a real place. Well, it was a real people. A real group of people. Josephus says they were the Scythians who lived in the area of the Black and the Caspian Sea. Okay, that's leaning towards a Greek Empire interpretation. Not a modern interpretation. In Revelation, Gog and Magog are countries which are the 4 corners of the earth. In rabbinic literature, Magog is an individual who leads an army against Israel during the Messianic age. So that's how the way they viewed it. Meshach and Tubal are a nation of Japheth. So this guy's going to be a white dude. Noah had how many sons? 3, right? You all went to the ark today, right? Yeah, so you saw all this. So he has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is the ancestor of Asians. So his ancestors, or his descendants, go out. That's where you get India, Oriental nations, China, Mongolia. All the Asian nations are descendants of Shem. The Arab people, the Indian people, the Chinese, and related countries, and even Native Americans. We know now for sure, due to genetic testing, that Native Americans had their origin in Asia. And all you got to do is take a Mongolian, these horse culture that rides around and lives in tents and lives off the land, and compare them to the Navajo. Put 2 of them beside each other and look at them, you'll go, okay, they're related. But some think that the sea levels were lower after the flood and there was a land bridge. Some think there was a mini ice age and people crossed across on ice bridges. But some people think they got in boats and sailed across the Pacific. I don't know. But somehow Asians got to the Americas, and that's where Native Americans come from. So if you've got some Native American in your ancestry, hey, you're part Semitic. Most of you here, though, have Japheth, written all over your white faces. So Japheth is where white people came from. And Ham's descendants are the ones that went down into Canaan. That's the Canaanites. They were black. And then Cush and Put and all down into Africa. The people who built the pyramids and the ancient Egypt culture, the people who invented, geometry and modern math, and they were all descendants of Ham. And those first modern cultures in Africa were all black people. And so what he's going to say here is he's going to gather armies. Now he's from Japheth, but it's going to say he's going to gather armies from Cush and from Put. And then he's going to talk about some others that are Semitic. And so he's gathering descendants of all of Noah's 3 sons into an army against Israel. And that's one of the things that I think fits with Antiochus Epiphanes and why I think it's probably him. But the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, and Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. They are referred to in Ezekiel They're mentioned as, now notice, these are literal nations. These are literal places that exist. Now, do they exist today? No. Can you go and find these descendants today? No, because people have intermarried and interbred, and the world's a great big melting pot, right? Like, we can only trace our ancestry back so far. Where did they come before that? I don't know. I don't know which of the sons of Japheth I'm from. I know I'm from one of them, but I don't know which one of nor my Semitic. I mean, my grandma was part Cherokee, so I have some Semitic. Do I know which one of the sons of Shem that I came from? No, because all of that dispersed and spread out. Now, back then, closer to the time, those nations and those people were still together with distinct languages and cultures. But over time, things have changed. I see people sometimes, they're like, we live on stolen land in America. Yeah, we do. Just like everywhere else. The people that are in Egypt right now are not the descendants of the people who built those pyramids. They came and conquered them, intermarried with them, and the Egyptians aren't the same Egyptians. And the Palestinians aren't the people who were not the original people of modern day Israel, and neither were the descendants of Abraham. The Canaanites were there first. It was called Canaan. And every nation on the earth has taken on the people that are English right now. They're not the descendants of people who lived in England in Jesus' day. Well, not most of them. There's a few, maybe the Celts, maybe the Welsh and the Cornish and the Scottish, but the Anglos and the Saxons invaded, and thus they're called Anglo-Saxons. And so there's this big melting pot. And so who knows that England could say this. People could say to the English, "You're living on stolen land." You go up to the King of England and say, "You're living on land your ancestors stole," and that'd be true. That's absolutely true, and that's true everywhere. There's not anywhere that's not true. I went when I was in the Apache Indian Reservation, and there was this Pueblo settlement there, right on the Indian Reservation, where the Apache's traditional homeland. And there's a house. I'm like, I didn't realize that the Apache built houses. I thought they were a nomadic people, a warrior people. I didn't know they built houses and farmed. And the guy there's like, they didn't. There was people that were here that farmed and lived in houses. The Apache were a warlike people, came and killed them, knocked their houses over, and took their land. And for 1,000 years before white people ever got there, the Sioux and the Lakota were at each other's throat, killing each other regularly. It was like a 1,000-year war. And you get this idea, oh yeah, the Native Americans were just living in peace, so happy before we... Now, I'm not saying that what we did to the American Indian was right. I'm not justifying it at all. I'm just saying we didn't do anything different than what they did. And everybody's on stolen land. And the question is now, are we going to steal people's land again? The question is, are we going to keep the cycle going, or are we going to end it? So, in Ezekiel 27:13, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, they were merchants. They traded persons, vessels, and brass. So this is a real people who traded with Tyre and Sidon. So he's talking about a real people in a real place. Who this Gog is exactly, we don't know. Who the nation is and who the people were and about where they were, we do know. Okay? So Ezekiel 32, Meshach and Tubal are there with all their hordes around the graves. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword because they spread the terror in the land of the living. So it talks about Meshach and Tubal earlier. Remember in the prophecy that we had against Egypt? And it talks about these people. And it says some of their kingdoms were dead because they were a warrior people who terrorized nations around them, so God wiped them out. And remember, we talked about each one of the nations that God destroys. And says, Egypt, you're going to be like these people because they terrorized their neighbor and God destroyed him. Egypt, you're going to be like these people because they terrorized their neighbors and God destroyed them. You're going to be like these people. You're going to terrorize your neighbors and God destroyed them. And that's the thing. Why did these horrible things happen to the Aztec? Because they terrorized their neighbors and God destroyed them. What happened to the Mayan? They terrorized their neighbors and God destroyed them. What happened to the Incas? God terrorized their neighbor and destroyed them. And what happened to the conquistadors that came over and destroyed them? They terrorized their neighbors and God destroyed them. And that's the thing. If you become a Napoleon, you meet a Napoleon fate. You become a Hitler, you meet a Hitler fate. You become a Soviet Union, you meet a Soviet Union fate. Every nation that aspires to be an empire uses its military power and its vast wealth and superiority to torment the nations around it. God wipes them out. And it's usually right after the climax of when they start killing their babies. So who is Meshach and Tubal? It's an actual country, an actual place that God had punished before, just like he punished Pharaoh. It's a real nation. So obviously, these two references that they were an ancient country, not future countries. There is no Meshach and Tubal anymore. Any more than there's a Hittite empire, or there's a Babylonian empire, or there's a Medo-Persian empire, or a Roman empire. The Roman empire doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anymore. Those nations have passed into history. So this can't be something that's fulfilled in the future, because these are nations from the past. There's not going to be another future prophecy where something happens with Edom. The Edomites are gone. Or Aram, the Aramites are gone. Or the Philistines. The Philistines are gone. And so are these people. So whatever this is about, it had to be back in this ancient time, in this intertestamental period. It can't be about Israelites coming back to Israel today. It has to be about the return of the Israelites back then, because that's the only time when Israel came back from captivity, resettled the land, and were living in peace and safety, and were attacked by these countries. So it had to have happened in the intertestamental period. That's when this has to be. So these two people were eventually driven back into the Black Sea. So, and people today, one of the ways they try, well, what it's about Moscow and Tobolsk, these two Russian countries. Well, what's the problem with that? Moscow and Tobolsk didn't exist until 1147 AD and 1187 AD. Those two cities didn't exist until these dates. So it can't be about them, because whoever these are already had been punished by God and already existed at the time Ezekiel wrote the book, and were known people. So when people try to make these two nations, areas, Moscow and Tobolsk, this other city in Russia, it's all about the commies and the Russians, it's biblical McCarthyism, seeing a commie in everything. The chief prince, some translate, the head leader of the Rosh, caused some to suspect Russia. Now, so he calls him the chief prince. That's how it's translated in the Bible, in the passage I just read. It's the word for leader. He's the Rosh. So they read it in Hebrew and it says Rosh. They say, see, he's the Rosh. That means it's Russia. Because Rosh sounds an awful lot like Russia to me. And they'll say it on their television program and write it in their book. And now send a check in to me for my ministry. It's Rosh. Well, Russia is an 11th century AD word. That word wasn't even used until 1100 years after Jesus. I mean, that means it's going to be 1600 years after Ezekiel writes this. And Gog was the chief priest of Meshach and Tubal. He was the head of an army from the north. The word Rosh means head, and that word appears 600 times in the Bible. So is everywhere the word Rosh is someone's called a leader, that means it's about Russia. It's just the word for leader in Hebrew. And it happens to start with the same letter as Russia. That's all. Well, it doesn't even start with the same letter. It starts with the same sound. They're different languages. Do you know that other languages use some of the syllables we use for words that mean something totally different? Think about that next time you order your fajita or your quesadilla. Cush in Ethiopia was to the south. and are black. They're descendants of Ham. The west is the north after of Ham. Gomer and Tamar, those are north and northeast. These have been the Seminarians, the Armenians, and they're Japhetic. Persia from the east, and Persia Gulf was Semitic. The Midrash and Tanchuma interprets Gog, Umagog to mean the assembly of every nation. The numerical value of the words is 70, which is supposed to be, supposedly, the ancients believe, was the number of nations God divided up the world into after the fall of Babel. And so what they think what some people interpret this to mean is all these nations are going to come against Israel. The whole world is going to come against Israel, and God's going to defend them. This means that those in the north, the east, the west, and the south are the enemies. They are from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They're miles apart from Israel, and it's hard to see how they would have a common interest except in their hatred of God's people. Am I really supposed to believe, if you do their weird interpretation, that Russia is going to lead an army along with the Ethiopians, because they're so warrior-like. The Ethiopians and the Egyptians, only not really the Egyptians, because the people that were Ham don't actually live there anymore, so I don't know where we're going to find them at, somewhere else in Africa, I guess. And they're going to join together with Iran and Afghanistan, and they're going to join together with people from the Crimean, and they're going to join together with some Arab people, and they're all going to attack Israel together for Israel's rich and vast wealth. And they're unwalled cities with no defenses. Yeah, modern Israel's so defenseless. They got like the best army in the world. They don't have a walled city, they have an iron dome. What does it mean? Oh, premillennialists want it to be in the future. This cannot be. How do we know? How am I so confident that this isn't about something that's yet to happen? Who the people that are meant to be is obviously unknown. Their allies have perished. However, the posterity of this nation may survive in modern nations. We know, for instance, who the descendants of Meshach and Tubal are. See special study in Khazars. But there are other problems that prove that this is an ancient battle. Okay? So we know who some of the descendants of these people are. But the problem is those people were nomadic. It's like the Roma people, the Gypsies and stuff like that. That's from the Khazars. So these people, they were nomadic, spread out people after this. They melted into the rest of society. The soldiers are all on horses. Do you really think there's going to be a future battle on horse? It says every soldier is going to be on a horse. It is while Israel is at rest and at peace without walls or bars and doors. Does that describe modern Israel? Is there peace in the Middle East and I missed it? Did I miss that? When did we get peace in the Middle East? Is that coming soon? Is that something I should expect any day now? Is for Israel to be at peace? Because I was just reading how they had this big conflict with Iran and bombed Iran this week. I don't think there's any peace in the Middle East that's coming anytime soon. Does it describe present Israel? Does she dwell in safety? It suggests other cities are walled, but Jerusalem is not. The techie unwalled cities. When was Israel unwalled? When did Israel, without defense properly? Intertestamental period. The goal of war was spoil. Oh, what are they all going to fight for? Oil? No, it says right in the passage what they're going after. They're calves. So Russia, Putin's going to get on the phone. Hey, Ethiopia, want to help me fight Israel and steal their calves? Is that what I'm supposed to believe? This stuff is just stupid. It's just dumb to believe this. The weapons are ancient. They got shields, bows, arrows, bucklers, swords. Now remember, they're saying the passage is literal, so we got to take everything literal. Like some people say, well, the weapons aren't literal. The horses represent tanks, and the shields represent, what, blah, blah, blah. They represent guns, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, really? That's interesting. So after the war's over, Israel's going to burn their tanks for firewood. Hey, would you pass me that RPG? I want to start a fire.
I wouldn't do that if
I
I were you.
wouldn't do that either. Hand me that AK-47. I need a... Come on. It's obviously, hey, I'm going to light this helicopter on fire I'm not collecting any firewood. It's obviously an ancient battle. And by the way, is Israel still cooking over open fires? Is that the way they cook their food in Israel? I haven't been, but I'm thinking they don't heat their homes nor cook their food. I think they got microwaves there. I think they got convection ovens and the ultimate high point of human creation, the air fryer. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Get one for your family for Christmas. They're wonderful. Israel's not using wood anymore. This is about ancient times. The descendants of Noah are given here, and we're told that where they're located. They're no longer there. They have been melted into the world's population. Obviously, it's referring to an ancient time, not to modern time or future time. It's a time when ceremonial cleanliness was demanded. The land must be cleansed of dead bodies. And Numbers 31:19 talks about that. I'm not going to bother reading it. We're in a hurry. So it's done in a very business-like way. Let's clean up and let's clean. Look, are we under the law still? Does Israel follow ceremonial uncleanness rules today, even modern Israel? No. They don't. Most of them are not orthodox, and half of them are atheists. They're secular Jews, the majority of Israel. And they're not caring about whether and they certainly wouldn't bury them like that. They'd get a bulldozer and put them in a big mass grave maybe, but they wouldn't be going around finding bones and it's preposterous. The whole thing is obviously about ancient times. So, the other thing is the premillennialists do when they try to take the modern view is they try to say Gog and Magog in here is the same as in Revelation, but there's a problem. In Ezekiel, Gog is a prince, right? Isn't that what I just read to you? In Revelation, Gog is a nation from the four corners of the earth. It's not even the same thing. Gog comes against Israel in Ezekiel, and Gog encompasses the city of God in Revelation. And Israel burns Gog's weapons in Ezekiel, and God sends fire and consumes them in the book of Revelation. So the accounts don't match because they're about different things. So why does both Ezekiel and Revelation talk about Gog and Magog? Because God is using an analogy from history. That's what symbolic literature does. In order to have a symbol, you have to be familiar with one of the things. If you aren't familiar with a symbol, then the symbol won't make any sense. And that's why we misunderstand the apocalyptic literature in Ezekiel and Revelation and in Daniel, is because we aren't studying the history and the understanding and the cultural viewpoint of the time, and so we don't get it. We don't understand it. Whereas if we understood their history and could reference things, it would make more sense. So stop and reason with me for a second, okay? Let's talk about Revelation for a minute. Is Sodom in the Old Testament? Was there a Sodom in the Old Testament?
Yes.
Was it a literal place?
Mm-hmm.
Is Sodom mentioned in the book of Revelation?
Yes.
Is it the same thing? No. He's referencing the sin of Sodom against modern people. There's a Jezebel in the Old Testament. She was an actual historical woman, right? And then there's a Jezebel in the book of Revelation. Was it the same lady? No. It was a lady who was like Jezebel. He was calling her a Jezebel. If I said to somebody who was on my team but helped the other side win, if I said, "You're a Benedict Arnold," am I saying that they're literally Benedict Arnold? Or Benedict Arnold's coming back from the dead? Or it's a descendant of Benedict Arnold? No. I'm saying you're a traitor. Benedict Arnold was a traitor. You're a traitor. And when you say somebody's a Jezebel, you're saying you're a deceptive, power-hungry, wicked woman. And I can think of a few of those in modern times. Can you? Babylon Was there a Babylon in the Old Testament? Is there a Babylon in Revelation? Same place? No. What does Peter say when he writes his book and he writes his epistle? All the brothers and sisters of Christians in Babylon greet you. Was he in Babylon? No, the city didn't exist anymore. It was destroyed. It's the haunt of jackals. The Bible predicts no one will ever live there again, and no one has. Where was he when he wrote? He was in Rome. Because Rome was a modern day Babylon. Okay? So he's using word pictures. Therefore, Gog and Magog in the Old Testament. Is there a Gog and Magog in the Old Testament? But is it the same as in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation? No. He's referencing a past event. And he's using the terminology to say a similar thing to what happened then is going to happen now. And so God's enemies were put down after the captivity, and so will those of the true Israel be put down. What it comes from. That's the analogy he's making. Now, he goes through here, and he says, well, let me summarize before I stop. I want to take what I was saying there and take it further. He talks about fire and brimstone. Was there ever a time when God destroyed his enemies with fire and brimstone? Yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Was there ever, he talked about sending floods. Did God ever send a flood to destroy the wicked? Yes. He talks about dropping hail on them. Was there ever a time that God dropped hail on the enemies of Israel to save Israel? Yes. He talks about how they'll rise up and fight against each other. Was there ever a time when God caused the enemy armies to fight against each other in confusion? Yes. So he's saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. All the times where God stepped in to create victory, he just lists all of them. So let's say I was going to write a prophecy about a future country invading the United States. Let's say I was a prophet and I said, the country of China is going to invade the United States. And when they attack, there'll be a shot fired on Concord Bridge that's heard around the world. And we're going to go through some hard times, and there's going to be a Valley Forge moments. But we'll remember the Alamo, and we will fight up the hill of Iwo Jima and gain victory. Now, am I literally saying we're going to shoot at Concord? Am I literally saying that we're going to go to Valley Forge? Am I literally saying that we're going to go to San Antonio, Texas, to the Alamo? There's no basement there, by the way. Or am I literally saying we're going to go up the Iwo Jima? No, I'm not saying that. What am I saying? I'm using famous victories in the past to describe a future battle. To describe what God's going to do. And what God is saying here in apocalyptic symbolic language is, you know how I fought for you here and here and here, and you had this great victory here and this great victory here, and you didn't even have to fight, and I fought here, and I knocked your, and I killed your enemies there. And then remember what I did in 2 Kings where I destroyed them all, and they fled, and you went out and plundered them. They came to plunder you, but you plundered them. That's what he's referencing. All of this here, if you knew Israel history, you would realize he's just going through God's greatest hits. And he's saying all those great victories that God fought for you, he's going to do it again. And when this guy comes and gets a bunch of other nations to join him and they attack you, you're going to win. That's what these two chapters is saying. Is all this stuff literal? No, it's apocalyptic. It's symbolic. He's referencing history. It's not that literal hail is going to come and that's not literal. What he's saying is, I'm going to fight for you and you're going to win. Okay? Let's take a break and we'll come back in 10 minutes.